The reading room smelled like stale coffee and carpet cleaner that hadn't quite covered something older underneath. My father's attorney, Gerald Marsh, had a round face and wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose as he shuffled through the papers on his desk. My older sister, Diane, sat to my left, one leg crossed over the other, her red lacquered nails tapping the armrest in a rhythm that made me want to scream. My mother sat between us, hands folded in her lap like she was in church. I had driven 7 hours from Raleigh that morning. I hadn't even changed out of my scrubs before I got the call that the reading was scheduled. 26 hours into a double shift, then straight onto I-95 North. My eyes burned. My feet still ached, but I was there, which was more than Diane deserved credit for noticing. Gerald cleared his throat and began reading. Our father, Vincent Calloway, had owned 3 things worth mentioning: a craftsman bungalow in Charlotte where my mother still lived, a 2-bedroom condo in downtown Nashville that he'd bought as a rental investment, and a farmhouse in Harlow, Vermont, with 11 acres of land attached that had belonged to his father and his father's father before that. Diane got the Nashville condo. I got the Vermont farmhouse. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone is waiting to see how the awkward thing plays out. Gerald looked at me over his glasses, probably hoping I'd nod and smile and make his afternoon easier. My mother stared at the window. Diane didn't wait for any of us. She turned to me slowly, with the kind of smile that takes years of practice to weaponize, and said, "Well, that tracks. A rundown farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, Vermont. Fits you perfectly, doesn't it? You've always been the one who liked playing in the dirt." A few people shifted in their chairs. My mother's hands tightened in her lap. Gerald very deliberately looked back down at his papers. I didn't say anything. I had been an ER nurse for 9 years. I had watched people come apart at the seams and learned how to stay calm while everything around me broke. I used that now. I let the words sit where they landed and did not react. But I felt it. Deep down past the professional calm, past the exhaustion and the grief, I felt it land exactly where she meant it to. Outside in the parking lot, after Gerald shook my hand and told me he'd send the full documentation by the end of the week, Diane appeared at my elbow. She had her sunglasses on now, keys dangling from 2 fingers, already half somewhere else. "Don't feel too bad," she said, not sounding like she meant it at all. "Dad probably thought he was doing you a favor. Something rustic and simple. That's kind of your brand, isn't it?" She walked to her car before I could answer. My mother came up beside me a few seconds later, and for one brief moment I thought she was going to say something that mattered. "She's under a lot of stress," my mother said instead. "The Nashville property comes with tenants and complications. It's not as simple as it looks." I looked at her. He left her a condo worth $400,000. She adjusted the strap of her purse. "These things are complicated, sweetheart. You know how Diane is." I did know how Diane was. That was the problem. The drive back to my car felt longer than it should have. I sat in the front seat for a few minutes without starting the engine. My father had been a quiet man, careful with his words, and slower to make decisions than most people could tolerate. He hadn't left me a note or a letter, nothing with an explanation attached. Just a piece of paper with my name on it and an address in Vermont I'd never visited. I thought about calling my friend Tasha, but what was I going to say? My sister just called me a dirt farmer at my father's will reading? She'd tell me to take the rest of the night off. I didn't have that luxury. I drove back to Raleigh, worked 3 more days, picked up a weekend shift because somebody called out, and then finally, on a gray Tuesday in late October, I loaded 2 bags into my car and drove north. The GPS took me off the highway an hour outside of Burlington, onto 2-lane roads that cut through hills already stripped down to bare branches. The towns got smaller and then almost disappeared entirely. Harlow, Vermont, turned out to be a general store, a post office the size of a bathroom, and a cluster of houses set back from the road like they were trying not to be noticed. The farmhouse was at the end of a half-mile gravel drive. When I pulled up and cut the headlights, I sat there for a long moment looking at it in the dark. The porch sagged on one side. One of the upstairs shutters hung crooked. The yard had gone wild from years of no one caring enough to push it back. Dad had never once mentioned this place. Not once in my entire life. I let myself in with the key Gerald had mailed me. The front door groaned and stuck and then gave way all at once, and the smell of the place came at me in a rush. Old wood, dried herbs. Something that took me a second to place, and then I did. Wood smoke. Faint but still there. Like someone had lit a fire in the last few months and not years ago. I found the light switch by feel. The lamps came on with a warm glow that surprised me. The floors were scuffed but solid. The furniture was plain and old but not falling apart. On the kitchen counter, a stack of mail sat next to a small ceramic dish with a note paper clipped to it. The note was in handwriting I didn't recognize. "Miss Calloway, your father asked me to look in on the place. Hope the drive wasn't too long. R. Hadley, next property over." Someone had been maintaining this house. The kitchen shelves had canned goods on them. The firewood box beside the hearth was full. In the upstairs bathroom, the pipes knocked once and then ran clear water when I turned the faucet. I leaned against the sink and looked at my face in the mirror. I had been awake for almost 20 hours. I looked it. But I was here, and the house was standing, and whoever R. Hadley was, my father had trusted them enough to leave them a key. I slept better that night than I had in months. In the morning, I walked the property in my coat with a coffee that I'd made from grounds I found in a sealed tin above the stove. The land stretched back behind the house, past a barn that leaned but hadn't fallen, past a stand of maples at the far edge, all the way to a low ridge that caught the first light in long orange lines. 11 acres. I had never owned land before. I didn't entirely know what that felt like, standing on it. On the way back, I noticed a figure coming up the fence line from the east. A woman, older, probably 65, in heavy work boots and a canvas jacket. She raised a hand when she saw me. "You look like him," she said when she was close enough. "Around the eyes." "You're R. Hadley," I said. "Ruth." She held out her hand and I shook it. It was a firm, dry handshake, the kind you only got from people who worked outside for a living. "I've been keeping an eye on this place going on 4 years now. Your dad paid me quarterly. He said one of his daughters would come eventually. He never mentioned any of this to me," I said. Ruth looked at me steadily. "He mentioned you to me." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and she seemed fine with that. She told me the well was good, had been tested 2 years ago, and the reading was clean. She told me the barn roof had a soft spot on the east side and I shouldn't go in that corner until I got someone to look at it. She told me the maple stand was tapped every February by a neighbor 2 roads over who split the syrup with whoever owned the property, per a handshake agreement that had been going on since before she moved to Harlow. She told me all of this like she was briefing me for a job, which I respected. "He put something away for you," she said before she left. "He didn't tell me what it was, just that you'd know where to look. He said his daughters always thought the kitchen was the heart of the house." I turned that over in my mind all morning. It took me until after lunch to find it. A section of the kitchen floorboard near the back wall where the baseboard heat registers ran. One plank gave slightly when I stepped on it. I pried it up with a flathead screwdriver from the tool drawer and found a fireproof document box sitting in a shallow crawl space wrapped in a canvas tarp. Inside, a thick folder of test results from a water quality firm out of Burlington, and a hand-typed summary letter on my father's stationery. I read it twice at the kitchen table, the afternoon light going flat gray in the windows. The farmhouse sat directly above a natural spring aquifer, one of the most consistently pure water sources in Windsor County, according to the testing documents. My father had been quietly documenting it for 6 years. He had been in preliminary conversations with a small batch bottling company out of New Hampshire called Ridgeline Pure about a licensing arrangement for the water rights alone, separate from any sale of the land itself. The estimated value of the rights, based on the most recent appraisal in the folder, was significant. Multiple zeros significant. At the bottom of the last page, in my father's neat handwriting, "This is yours, Emma, not the family's, not to be split, yours. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I wanted it to be safe first. Love, Dad." I set the letter down. My hands were shaking slightly, the way they used to shake after a bad shift before I learned to manage it. My sister had called this place a dirt farm. My mother had shrugged and moved on. My father had been sitting on this information for 6 years, building a case, making it airtight, and he had left all of it to me. I stayed in the farmhouse for 3 more days before anything went wrong. On the 4th morning, I was in the barn clearing out the safe corner Ruth had shown me when I heard a car on the gravel drive. I came out through the barn doors and found a white Subaru sitting in front of the house. A man in his 40s was walking the perimeter of the property with his phone out, taking pictures. "Can I help you?" I called out. He turned around with a practiced smile. "Morning. Are you the owner?" "I am. What are you doing on my property?" He introduced himself as a representative from a company called Clearwater Holdings and said they were in the process of evaluating land in the area for potential development partnership opportunities. He said they'd been in contact with a family member who indicated the property might be available. I walked toward him steadily. Which family member? He looked briefly uncomfortable. I don't have that information readily available. I told him he had 2 minutes to get back in his car, or I'd call the sheriff's department. He went. I called my sister. She answered on the third ring, cheerful in the way she got when she was pleased with herself. Emma. How's the farmhouse? You sent someone here, I said, from Clearwater Holdings. A pause. Then, smoothly. I was just trying to help. You don't know the first thing about managing land. I have real estate contacts. I know how to get value out of a property. You sent someone to walk my land without my permission, Diane. It's a consultation, not an invasion. You're being dramatic. This is why Dad felt like he had to coddle you. You can't handle the business side of anything. I hung up and sat with the anger for exactly long enough to get it under control. Then I called Gerald Marsh. He was calm and precise. He told me the deed was clean, the water rights were fully documented in my name, and that Clearwater Holdings had no legal basis to be on the property without my explicit consent. He offered to send a formal cease and desist to my sister and to any company she'd been in contact with on behalf of the property. He also walked me through how to file a no trespassing notice with the county, which I did that afternoon from his office over the phone. Your father was thorough, Gerald said at one point, in a tone that sounded like quiet admiration. He really was, I said. My mother called that evening. I answered because I always answered for her, some old habit I hadn't broken. Emma, Diane is upset. She feels like you're shutting her out. I watched the sun going down through the kitchen window, streaking the ridgeline orange and red. She sent strangers to walk my property, Mom. She was trying to help. You don't have experience managing something like this. Neither did she before she got her real estate license. She learned. I can learn too. My mother's voice took on the careful tone she used when she thought she was being diplomatic. She has more tools at her disposal. You're away in North Carolina. You're working impossible hours. She could manage this in a way that benefits the whole family. There it was, the whole family. Always deployed as a reason, never as an actual consideration. Dad made his decision, I said. He left this to me. Not to the family. To me. Don't be selfish about this, sweetheart. I kept my voice level. I was too tired for anything else. I have to go, Mom. That night, Ruth came by with a pot of chili and sat across the kitchen table from me while I ate. I told her about Clearwater Holdings, about the phone call with Diane, about my mother's deflection. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. Land does something to people, she said when I finished. Even people who didn't care about it until they heard it might be worth money. She laughed at this place 2 weeks ago. Ruth nodded once. Now she's circling. I told her about the documents, the water rights, the conversations my father had been having with Ridgeline Pure. I wasn't sure why I told her, except that she had earned some version of the truth by caring for the place when no one else did. She sat with it for a moment. Your father talked about those springs like they were something holy, she said finally. Said his own father used to bring buckets of that water to the house because the well was bad. Said it tasted different from anything else. Did you know he was documenting it? I suspected. He had a hydrology fellow out here twice. Didn't tell me why, but I figured. I looked at her. Why didn't you tell anyone? She looked back at me steadily. Wasn't mine to tell. I went to bed thinking about my father, about all the things he had known and held close, and passed down in the quiet way he did everything. He had never been a man who announced himself. He had just built things carefully and hoped the right people would understand. I was beginning to understand. 3 days later, Diane called again. Her voice had shifted from cheerful to something that was trying to sound reasonable. I've thought about this more, she said. I want to be fair. You can keep the farmhouse itself, use it as a vacation property, whatever you want. But the water rights, that's a different conversation. That's an asset that affects the whole family. We should manage it together. I leaned against the porch railing. The cold air came off the ridge in a steady line. The water rights belong to the property, Diane. They're not separate. Everything is negotiable. Dad left the property to me in full. He was clear. Her tone dropped. You have no idea what you're dealing with. These things get contested. Courts look at fairness, at who contributed to the family, at who was present. You were in North Carolina for 9 years. I was here. I helped Mom. I helped Dad when he was sick. I was present. You were an abstraction. The word hit harder than she probably knew. An abstraction. Like the years I spent in the ER, the nights I missed the holidays, the calls I took when I had 30 seconds between patients, all of that had just been a blur to them. An absence where a daughter should have been. "I'm not negotiating," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Fine. My attorney will reach out to Gerald." She hung up. I stood there with the phone in my hand and watched a hawk circle over the maples in slow, patient loops. Ruth appeared at the fence line like she had a sixth sense for trouble. "Lawyers?" she called. "Lawyers," I confirmed. She came through the gate. "Well, get yourself a good one and don't move an inch." Gerald handled the filing with efficiency I was grateful for. Diane's attorney sent a letter claiming the inheritance had been inequitable and requesting mediation. Gerald responded with documentation that filled a binder. 6 years of my father's careful preparation, dated correspondence, notarized water rights transfers, the complete hydrological assessment. Every page a wall she couldn't get past. "She can file," Gerald told me on the phone, "but she won't win. Your father specifically anticipated this kind of challenge. He documented everything in a way that makes his intent unmistakably clear." "He really thought about this," I said. "He called me 3 times in the last year of his life," Gerald said. "He wanted to make sure it was right. He talked about you every time." I didn't have words for that. I thanked him and got off the phone before my voice did something I didn't want. That weekend, my mother drove up from Charlotte. I hadn't invited her, but I didn't turn her away either. She arrived on a Saturday morning, her car packed like she was staying longer than a day. She stood in the driveway for a moment, looking at the farmhouse with an expression I couldn't read. "Your father used to talk about this place when we first met," she said. "Before I knew what it was, he'd say, 'Someday I'll show you the old place.'" I thought it was just a way of talking. I didn't answer. I let her come inside and I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table together, and I waited for whatever she had actually driven 6 hours to say. It took until the second cup. "I haven't been fair to you," she said. Not an apology exactly, not yet, but an acknowledgement. Coming from her, that was something. I looked at my hands around the mug. "No, you haven't. Diane is easier," she said. "She's always been easier, louder, more present. I let that be a reason. She humiliated me in front of Gerald. In front of everyone. You didn't say a word." My mother closed her eyes briefly. I know I didn't." The silence between us stretched. Outside, the wind moved through the maples and the bare branches clicked against each other. "He loved you fiercely," she said finally. "Your father. He talked about you the way he talked about this land. Quietly. Like it meant too much to be said out loud too often." I thought about the letter in the document box. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I wanted it to be safe first." "I know," I said. She looked around the kitchen. At the canned goods on the shelves, the patched window above the sink, the firewood stacked neatly by the back door. The particular kind of care in a place where someone has been paying attention. "What will you do with it?" she asked. I told her what I'd been thinking about. Not just the water rights, not just the licensing arrangement with Ridgeline Pure, though those would provide the foundation financially. Something else. Something I'd been drafting in a notebook by the window in the evenings when the house went quiet. The land had good outbuildings once you cleared the soft corner in the barn. The spring produced more water than any licensing deal would require. The area had almost no services for people who needed transitional support after medical crises, an absence I understood from 9 years of watching patients get discharged with nowhere solid to land. A recovery and wellness residence, small. 6 rooms to start. For people who needed a quieter, supported space while they rebuilt their health and their footing, partially funded by the water rights income. Partially funded by a small batch farming operation that Ruth had already told me she'd help manage. My mother listened to all of it. Her expression shifted somewhere in the middle from politely attentive to something that looked like genuine recognition. "Your father would have called that a real use of good land," she said. "I know," I said again. She stayed 2 nights. On the second evening, we walked the property together in the last of the November light, all the way back to the maples and the ridge. She didn't say much, neither did I. But by the time we got back to the house, something between us had shifted, not all the way, not immediately, but in the direction of repair. Diane arrived the following Friday without calling first. I heard the car in the driveway and watched from the porch as she stepped out in heels that were completely wrong for the gravel and the mud. She had her attorney with her, a man in a tan coat who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I came down the steps and stood in front of the house. Ruth appeared from the direction of the fence line like a quiet piece of backup I hadn't asked for and was glad to have. "I want to talk," Diane said. Her voice had the edge it got when she was losing ground and knew it. "Then talk," I said. "Not like this, professionally, person to person. You brought an attorney to a conversation." She glanced at the man beside her. He had the grace to look at his shoes. "The water rights," she said. "The licensing deal. You know what that's worth, Emma. You know what we could do with that money as a family." "I know what I'm going to do with it," I said. "I told Mom. She can tell you." Diane's jaw tightened. "You're going to turn a valuable asset into a charity project. Into something that lasts," I said, "which is what Dad wanted." She stepped closer. "You've been a nurse in a hospital for 9 years. You don't know anything about running a business, managing a property, handling investors. You're going to make a mess of this and then come looking for help, and by then it'll be too late." I looked at her for a long moment. She was the same as she had always been, just louder now, more desperate around the edges. "I've worked 30-hour shifts, Diane. I've kept people alive on 4 hours of sleep with broken equipment and no backup. I think I can manage 11 acres in a spring." She stared at me. For the first time in my memory, she didn't have an immediate answer. Her attorney touched her elbow. She shook him off. Then she turned and walked back to the car, heels catching in the gravel twice. He followed. She paused at the car door. "This isn't over." "I know," I said. She drove away in a spray of gravel that Ruth watched with her arms crossed and a mildly satisfied expression. "She'll come back around," Ruth said, "or she won't. Either way, the spring doesn't care." I laughed. It came out louder than I expected, out there in the cold air in front of my father's farmhouse. It felt real. The months that followed were the hardest work I'd done since nursing school, and the most purposeful. Gerald finalized the licensing agreement with Ridgeline Pure in January. The numbers were better than the preliminary appraisal had suggested. I put the first installment into a dedicated account and started the process of filing for nonprofit status with the state of Vermont. I took a leave of absence from the hospital in Raleigh. It was supposed to be 3 months. By the time the 3 months were up, I had a roofing crew on the barn and a landscaper helping Ruth clear the back meadow for a kitchen garden. I extended the leave. In March, my mother came back. This time she asked first. She spent a week helping me sort through the farmhouse, keeping what mattered, clearing what didn't. We found a photograph tucked inside a book on the bedroom shelf. My father, maybe 22 years old, standing in front of the house in summer with a woman I didn't recognize. On the back, in faded ink, Grandpa's place. The spring fed everything. I put it on the mantel. By April, the first room was ready. A woman named Patrice came through a referral from a social worker I knew from my ER days, 53, recovering from a severe cardiac event, no family nearby, no support system to speak of. She stayed 6 weeks. When she left, she hugged Ruth in the driveway for a long time, and then stood by her car looking back at the house. "How long has this place been here?" she asked. "Long time," I said. "It'll be here a while longer." She nodded like that was exactly the right answer. The official opening was on a clear day in late May, the kind of day Vermont produces maybe 6 times a year, when everything is that specific shade of green that doesn't exist anywhere else. Ruth had baked 3 pies. A reporter from the Burlington paper came, and the director of a veterans support organization from Montpelier, who I'd been in correspondence with about a potential partnership. I stood on the porch and looked out at the people moving around the yard, the new beds in the garden, the barn with its repaired roof gleaming, the ridge with the early summer light pouring down it. Diane didn't come. I hadn't expected her to. My mother came. She stood near the garden with Ruth and talked for a long time about things I couldn't hear from where I was standing. At one point she laughed, really laughed, the way she used to when I was small, and I had to look away for a second. Gerald was there too, with a younger woman from his office who had been the one drafting most of the foundation paperwork over the winter. He found me near the end of the afternoon and shook my hand. "Your father would be pleased," he said. "I hope so," I said. "I think so." He nodded. He was a man who played a long game. He saw this coming years before any of us did. I thought about that, about a man who had driven up here quietly, tested the water, made the calls, built the case, and said nothing to me because he wanted it to be safe first. Who had looked at me across years of long-distance phone calls and missed holidays and holidays I managed to make it back for, and seen something worth trusting. After most of the guests had gone, I walked back to the spring alone. Ruth had shown me where it surfaced, a small stone-lined opening near the back of the property where the water came up cold and clear from whatever depth it lived at in the dark. I crouched down and put my hand in. It was cold enough to ache. My father had been right about the taste, clean and mineral and completely itself, the kind of thing you couldn't fake or manufacture. I sat there for a while with the late light coming through the maples and the sound of people and laughter still drifting from the yard behind me. Diane had called this place worthless. My mother had shrugged and let her. My father had driven up here 6 times in his last years, alone, in the quiet way he did everything, and turned a farmhouse in a small Vermont town into a foundation I hadn't known I needed. I stood up and dried my hand on my jeans. The real payback was never about Diane. It was never about winning an argument at a will reading or shutting down a legal filing or watching her back down in a gravel driveway with her heels sinking in the mud. It was about the 7 people who had already stayed in the rooms upstairs and left differently than they came. About the garden Ruth was already planning to double in size next spring. About the spring that had been running cold and clean under this land since before anyone in my family was born. My sister wanted money. My father gave me something that couldn't be spent. I walked back up to the house, back to the people still gathered there, and I let the door fall shut behind me.